Okay, folks. So this is a kind of a impromptu, I guess, lecture on a technology called Bootstrap. And so let me pull over a browser window and introduce Bootstrap. Responding. Okay. So what have we learned so far? So, we learned the fundamentals of HTML. We learned the fundamentals of CSS. We learned CSS colors and CSS font sizes and fonts. And then we learned CSS positioning, which I said many times. CSS positioning is one of the hardest things about HTML and CSS. CSS positioning is one of the hardest things. And then we learned Flexbox, and Flexbox really helps us with positioning, but Flexbox is not used very often, and from what I can tell, Flexbox is not used very often for entire page layouts. And so that leads us into this technology, what they call a framework called Bootstrap. It used to be called Twitter Bootstrap. The reason it was called Twitter Bootstrap is because coders at Twitter made this what's called a framework. It's called the reason it's called a framework is it's because it is a collection of technologies that we will use as a tool. Like this is like a tool in our tool belt to develop entire websites that are responsive. Okay, so the big thing here is that this is a tool that contains HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And by using this tool, we learn to write our HTML a certain way to develop entirely responsive websites. Okay, and so this tool is widely used across websites on the internet. So maybe if I search for Instacart, Wire. Again, this used to be called Twitter Bootstrap, and I don't even know if this is the most up-to-date list. I just Googled this, off the top of my head. But this tool is widely used. Well, that's a pretty big one. Lyft. Across the internet. So very common tool. So when, and arguably I could put it like this, this is the most important tool for learning responsive web design. What we've learned so far with media queries and floats and everything we've learned so far with having a brain fart with the Flexbox, goodness, with Flexbox, that's all valid, that's all useful, and Bootstrap uses a lot of those tools, right? Bootstrap uses Flexbox, Bootstrap uses media queries, so you have to know how to work with media queries to understand in detail how to work with Bootstrap. Like to really customize Bootstrap, you need to know how to work with those things. But Bootstrap is a more used tool. It's the most used tool that I can think of for responsive web design. So I think in today's demonstration in this video, what I will do is I will record just, I'll make a site with Bootstrap and we'll start from the ground up. And I'll demonstrate, how easy it can be to get started using Bootstrap. So let me pop open a code editor, and let me open up. We're going to put this as if we're still working on chapter 10, because this is taking the place of chapter 10. So I'm going to put this in chapter 10 homework. Actually, I'm not even going to start with my Emmet. The main site for Bootstrap is called getbootstrap.com, and you go to this website and you're going to find all the documentation as well as how to get started. Click on this Get Started button. This is how I like to get started. There's more than one approach. I prefer to click on this Get Started, and they kind of give you line by line what to copy. Like here, copy and paste this into your HTML head. This is for linking to CSS. Now this is called, and we haven't really used this much at all, but this is called a CDN. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. And all that means is this CSS file right here, if you see what I'm highlighting, this CSS file is made available to us to use across the internet. And so this is not a CSS file that we have to code ourselves. Instead, this is a CSS file that was built by someone else. It was built, again, originally by people at Twitter, developers at Twitter. They made this CSS file. And when we use Bootstrap, we're going to be using their custom styles, kind of their built-in styles. Same thing with the JavaScript that's used. Here you'll notice that it uses something called jQuery, and we'll get into jQuery. It's something called Popper. So it uses jQuery, uses something called Popper, and then here's the actual JavaScript for the Bootstrap. Now, kind of like the first thing, if you're gonna get Bootstrap to work, is you have to get the Bootstrap CSS linked properly, and you have to get the jQuery linked properly. And it says place the following script tags near the end of your pages right before the closing body. So you'll notice this goes up in the HTML head. These script tags go towards the bottom, towards the closing body. Now, you can just manually plug those in, but I actually like to just start. It's even easier to just kind of copy this and paste just like that. Okay, now you'll notice we do not have any custom CSS here, but if I launch this page, all I did was I went down to the starter template, I clicked on this copy button, and I paste this in. Now if I look at this, you can already see this looks a little different. Why does this hello world look a little different? Well, I would tell you first off, the font. You can see that H1s by default have a font size of 2.5 rems, right? That's root M's, right? So the font size of our H1s is about 2.5 size the root. We got some margin applied to our H1. There's a font weight of 500 that's applied. There's a line height in our H1. So where's all this coming from? This is all coming from that CSS. We automatically got box sizing border box. Okay, again, coming from our bootstrap.css. And honestly, a lot of this comes from sometimes your JavaScript can write CSS. So not to really murky the waters, but sometimes we're going to get our CSS right from this file, from the Bootstrap CSS. Sometimes we get it from the JavaScript that modifies the CSS. So JavaScript can do that. It can write its own CSS. But you'll notice it does look a little different. there's really not much to respond to here. I mean, it's not really a responsive site yet. But you'll just notice if this font is a little bigger and it looks like a different font, because this is, I don't think, the default font. This is a different font. I'm not sure what font it is. Somewhere in here it'll tell me. One of these, font family, Apple system. I don't have an Apple system, so maybe Blink Mac system font. I don't think I've got that. So maybe this is my font, right? But here's my font family tag that comes from, again, a style sheet, probably constructed style sheet, probably from the JavaScript. Okay, so that's how that's like step one. Step one, go to getbootstrap.com, click on Get Started, pull down this starter template, and it really breaks down the different pieces that are in here. We got the meta name viewport, which we've talked about that in class, the meta char set. We still have the HTML head. We still have the HTML body. There's really not much going on as far as markup except for an H1 tag that we'll just take out. Okay, now, so that's getting started. It's really that simple. Now, there are other ways. A couple things to mention. If you don't want to use a CDN, you could download all these files. And you can download these onto your computer and then link to them locally. Okay, and there's pros and cons to doing that. I guess the most compatible thing to do, or the best practice, would be use both a CDN. A CDN is using someone else's server, and use a backup local copy. That way, if the CDN is down for whatever reason, you still have a local copy that could be downloaded by the end user. They would use your local copy instead of the CDN. But for everything that you're going to do in this class, and to keep it simple, just go ahead and use the CDN. CDN's really easy. So you could download local files, but I prefer just use this starter template. Another thing to mention is that Bootstrap is constantly going through versions, and so Bootstrap version 1, Bootstrap version 2, Bootstrap version 3, and this is Bootstrap version 4. You can see that right there in the name of the CSS. You can kind of see this is coming from Bootstrap CDN, Bootstrap folder, version 4. So this is the version number. The 0.5. The 0.5, every time this is called the feature release. So this is version 4 with a feature release of features 5. So features 5 has more features than features 4. 4.4, and then you go down from there. There's less features in 4.3. There's less features in 2 and less features in 1. So the higher the second number, the more features that there have been released into version 4. And this last number is the bug fixes. And so you have a new feature, and there might be some bugs, and so they might update the feature version 5 with a .1, a .2, a .3, and those fix bugs, and they also work with performance. And so every time this last number here, it might get faster, or it might fix some of the bugs. Okay, this is important, the version number, because depending on the version number of Bootstrap that you're working with, you will write Bootstrap differently. And so one of the most important things when you're working on a Bootstrap site, like if I go working on a brand new client site and I see that the site is using Bootstrap, I need to know what version of Bootstrap that they wrote, so that I can continue working in that version, right? So if I'm working on a Bootstrap site from version 3, that might be from 2016. That might be from 4 years ago. So you need to come into getbootstrap.com and change the version so that you are writing when you go into actually writing Bootstrap, you can see that we're working with the version 3.4. Okay, and we'll get into all the things that you can do with Bootstrap. But again, the version number is very important. So 4.5, as you can see here, is being labeled as the latest version. When you go to getbootstrap.com, it kind of defaults to 4.5. However, Bootstrap 5 came out this summer, but it's in alpha. It's in alpha, and you don't want to build a new site when a technology is in an alpha phase, because the odds of something changing before it actually gets into release mode, put air quotes, release mode, before it really gets released, the odds of something changing are great. And so you might code a Bootstrap 5 site and you're coding it according to the documents, and then when it goes from alpha to release, alpha, beta, and then release, a lot of changes could happen and your entire site breaks. And so there is a new Bootstrap version 5. I'm not going to focus on Bootstrap 5 in this class because it's still in alpha. Okay, and I don't want you to write, I don't want you to learn something to write something a certain way and then just it changes tomorrow, right? So that's not a good idea. Okay, so we are going to stick with Bootstrap version 4, keeping in mind that there are some older versions that you might come across as you're in this class. And if you come across a Bootstrap version 3, you need to go to the Bootstrap 3 documentation to write that version correctly, to write that code correctly. Okay, so we know what Bootstrap is. It's a framework, which is a collection of HTML, CSS, JavaScript to build mobile responsive sites easily. And so if I click on this documentation now, let's start with components. This is the easiest place to start. And so Bootstrap on the surface is not very hard to work with. When I go to the documentation, you can kind of see over on the left-hand side the different things that we can work with. We can work with Bootstrap layout. And so how do we work with page layout in Bootstrap? And you can kind of see what we'll get into called the grid system. So there's layout, there's content. And so, working with Bootstrap images, how do we make responsive images? And how do we make responsive tables with Bootstrap? How do we make Bootstrap typography, so changing the font? Then there's Bootstrap Components, and these Bootstrap Components are just different, components, different individual things that you can add to your Bootstrap site. Under Components on this left-hand side, there's a lot of Bootstrap Components, and so I think one of the more obvious things to get started with would maybe be a nav bar. And so here you can see in the documentation, what does this really take? It's easy enough to do this. What does it really take to do this is what I'm saying. You can come down here, copy a nav bar to your clipboard. Okay, so what I did is I just click copy. And what that's going to give me is this example right here. This is going to build this nav bar. So I just copy this code. So just getting started, get this going. I'm going to replace this hello world. I'm going to paste in that nav bar. And what we have here is a fully responsive nav bar that goes down and does, like we, remember how I said my brain is choppy this morning. There was a nav bar that we learned to do this, Slick Nav. And so, got a question here. Do they change dramatically, or are the concepts still the same? No, the concepts are the same. We still have media queries. We still have, a lot of the tools, but I think that answered the question. Now, so that's to get started, but there's a whole lot of code in here. And here's the biggest difference. Bootstrap uses classes to do everything. And so how do we get all that function out? All we wrote was HTML. See that? All we did was wrote HTML. We didn't write any CSS. We didn't write any JavaScript. And to get a nav bar like this, so far in this class, we would have had to write the HTML, we would have had to write the CSS, and we would have had to write the JavaScript to get, remember when we did Slick Nav, we had to use JavaScript to get this kind of functionality. Okay? Bootstrap takes all that hard work out essentially for you and replaces it with classes. And so you see in here, this nav tag is decorated with certain classes. BG light gives it the background color of a light background color. If you scroll down, these are all different examples of nav bars with different classes that style. And what I was getting at down here is that we've got navbar light, we've got navbar dark, navbar dark with BG dark, navbar dark with BG primary. That's the second one. So let's change this from navbar light. Let's go into here. Navbar dark and BG hyphen primary. So what I'm going to do is change my BG primary, makes it this blue. See? So that's a little weird to think, is that to change my colors before, I used to go to the CSS. Now with Bootstrap, everything, a lot can be done right with the classes on our HTML. And of course, I just grabbed the first nav bar in this list, right? But if you were to break down, in here, you could see that there's a list item right here that has a nested div inside of the list items. And then inside of that div, it has a class of drop-down menu with 3 anchor tags inside of it. So all this right here, that little chunk of code right there, makes this drop down right here. Okay, let's go on to another component. Like here's a carousel. A carousel is a slideshow component for cycling through elements, images, or sliding of text. So let's copy this carousel. Actually, before I do that, I want to do a layout thing real quick. I want to get a wrapper. So in the wrapper, I want a class of container. And we're going to have to spend some more time on this. Let's do div class of container fluid. So I'm going to, in my body, put a div class of container fluid, and I'm going to put this nav bar inside of a container. Okay, I formatted that up. But now you can see that all of my nav bar is inside of this div. Okay, and what that did is it gave me just a little bit of space on the left and on the right that it's kind of inside of a wrapper, right? Before it was just 100% width, and now it's inside of a wrapper. Okay, so to do a wrapper is done with div class of container fluid. Then I can go into the grid. This is how the grid system works. You have div class of row. So this outer div right here, this is our row. And then you have div class of column small, column small, column small. This grid system is more complex, but I'm just going to use this as my simple example of 3 columns. And I'm going to get into more detail because the grid system, or the column system, underneath the nav, I'm going to put my 3 columns. See that? And then once you get down to a small, because this is a small device like a cell phone, it goes into 1 column. So basically small and up is 3 columns, but once you hit small, it goes down to a single column. Okay, and again, there's more explanation that you guys will need. So inside of that middle column, right? Inside of the middle column, I'm just kind of winging this here a little bit. Let's go into a component. And let's get the carousel. And you can see that this is kind of automatically timed. And then you can see you could do it with controls. So let's do it with controls. The with controls is a little bit more complex code, but it's not too bad because you start with the copying it. Let's paste the carousel in our middle column. And let's update the image, right? So let's just pick up 3 images of Rankin. That's a pretty big image. You can see the dimensions there. Save image as. And this was homework. Chapter 10 homework. I'm going to call this r1.jpg. Save image as. r2.jpg. And ideally these images would all be the same size, but R3. They're not even in an images folder. R1.jpg, R2.jpg, R3.jpg. And now we've got our carousel in the middle column that is responsive. So as you scroll it up, as you scroll it down, it automatically responds. I know this is a quick lecture, but I hope you see the value in this tool in just this like getting started tutorial, right? This makes web development, the task of responsive web design, much easier than what we've been doing, okay? Which was all fundamentals, and it's all important to know how media queries work and etc. And there still are media queries. And when you inspect, you'll find media queries in the style here, in the CSS. Okay, and you got to know how to work with those. But essentially what we've done, I think we're what day number are we on class? This is going to be quick off topic, but let's see what day number we're on. 25. Okay, yeah, let's call it day 25. We spent the first 25 days learning the fundamentals of HTML, CSS, positioning, all this stuff. We're going to spend the next 15 days, which brings us to the halfway point, learning Bootstrap, okay, and mastering this tool to the best of our ability, because this is the most commonly used, easiest to use, industry standard way of coding responsive websites. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop this presentation here. This was just an introduction, but class is kind of coming to an end here. I'm gonna stop this here. We will continue to learn Bootstrap. This is just an introduction, and we'll pick up, with the next kind of video on Bootstrap, because we got more to learn.